The heavy iron gates of Mc Raeven Mansion groaned as the wind pushed them open, revealing the long-forgotten path to the estate. Agent Davis, leading the newly assembled Spectre team, felt a shiver run down his spine. The government had briefed them on the mansion's bloody history, but nothing could have prepared them for the oppressive atmosphere that surrounded the place. The air was thick with a malevolent energy, as if the ground itself held the memories of every dark deed committed within the mansion's walls. As they approached the entrance, the team exchanged uneasy glances. The mansion loomed above them, its windows like dark, empty eyes watching their every move. Ivy crept up the walls, and the wood of the front door was splintered and rotting. Davis pushed the door open, and it creaked ominously, revealing a grand, decaying foyer. Dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through the dirty windows, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and rot. Agent Riley, the team's tech specialist, began setting up the equipment, his hands trembling slightly. He had faced the paranormal before, but this place was different. It felt alive, hungry. Medium Sophia closed her eyes, feeling the mansion's dark energy press in on her. She could sense the presence of spirits, malevolent and desperate, lingering in the shadows, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the floorboards creaked under their feet, and the temperature dropped several degrees. The team's breath became visible in the cold air, and a low, guttural whisper echoed through the foyer. Sophia's eyes snapped open, her face pale. "Something's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Before anyone could react, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang, sealing them inside. The team spun around, weapons drawn, but there was nothing there, only the dark, empty hallway. The whispering grew louder, coming from all directions, surrounding them. Davis signaled the team to move forward, his pulse quickening. They had a mission to complete, and turning back wasn't an option. As they ventured deeper into the mansion, the oppressive atmosphere grew worse. The walls seemed to close in on them, the shadows growing darker and more sinister. Sophia felt a presence following them, something ancient and malevolent, something that had been awakened by their arrival. They reached the grand staircase, its banister twisted and splintered, leading up into the darkness. As they began to ascend, a loud thud echoed through the house, followed by a low growl that reverberated through the walls. Sophia suddenly froze, her eyes wide with terror. "There's something upstairs," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing whispers. "Something waiting for us." The team exchanged nervous glances, their fear palpable. They had faced the unknown before, but never anything like this. As they continued up the staircase, they could feel the malevolent presence growing stronger, closer. Whatever was waiting for them in the darkness above, they knew it wasn't human. The second floor was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the flickering flashlights that barely penetrated the thick, suffocating shadows. The air was stifling, filled with the scent of decay and something far more sinister. As they moved through the narrow hallway, the temperature continued to drop, each breath visible in the freezing air. Sophia stopped suddenly, her hand outstretched, fingers trembling. "It's here," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "I can feel it watching us." Riley pointed his EMF reader down the hallway, the device spiking wildly as they approached a large, ornate door at the end. The wood was cracked and splintered, and an ominous red glow seeped from the gaps in the frame. Davis signaled for the team to prepare themselves, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever lay beyond that door, it was powerful, more powerful than anything they had ever encountered. As Davis reached for the door handle, the red glow intensified, and the whispers that had plagued them since their arrival grew louder, more insistent. They could almost make out words, but they were distorted, twisted, spoken in a language that didn't belong to this world. Davis hesitated, feeling the intense malevolence emanating from the other side, but he knew there was no turning back. The door creaked open, revealing a large circular room bathed in an eerie, pulsating red light. The walls were covered in symbols and sigils, drawn in what looked like dried blood. At the center of the room was an altar, old and worn, with deep grooves carved into the stone surface. Above the altar, a large black mirror reflected the room, but the reflection was wrong, distorted, with shadowy figures moving just out of sight. As they stepped into the room, The door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The air became suffocating, the red light flickering as if alive. The temperature dropped to freezing, and the shadows in the mirror began to move closer, their forms becoming more distinct. Suddenly, the whispers coalesced into a single guttural voice, echoing through the room, shaking the very walls. "Leave or die," Sophia gasped, her eyes locked on the mirror. The shadowy figures were no longer just reflections. They were emerging from the glass, their forms becoming solid, their eyes glowing with a deep crimson light. One by one, they stepped out of the mirror, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by some unseen force. The team backed away, their weapons drawn, but the creatures kept coming, their twisted forms blocking any escape. The air was thick with malice, and the sound of their growls reverberated through the room. Davis fired at the nearest creature, but the bullets passed through it harmlessly, as if it were made of smoke. "We need to get out of here," Riley shouted, panic in his voice, but there was no way out. The door was sealed, and the creatures were closing in, their crimson eyes burning with hunger. As the team prepared for what seemed like certain death, the voice echoed through the room once more, louder, more menacing. "Your souls are mine." The shadows lunged at them, and the room was plunged into darkness. The room was pitch black, but the darkness wasn't empty. It felt alive, pressing in on them from all sides, suffocating and heavy. Sophia's breath came in ragged gasps as she fumbled for the flashlight she had dropped. The air was thick with the scent of blood and decay, and something else, something far more sinister. She could feel the creatures from the mirror moving around them, their presence like ice on her skin. "Everyone, stay close." Davis's voice was barely audible over the sound of the blood pounding in her ears. She finally found her flashlight, but when she turned it on, the beam barely penetrated the darkness, as if the shadows were devouring the light. "Where are they?" Riley's voice was shaky, panic creeping in as he scanned the room with his own flashlight. The creatures were gone, but the oppressive feeling remained, as if they were still being watched by unseen eyes. "They're here," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling. "They're in the darkness, waiting." Suddenly, the mirror flickered to life, its surface swirling with shadowy tendrils. The reflection showed the team standing in the room, but behind them, dark figures began to emerge from the shadows, their eyes glowing red. The room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the very walls vibrating with it. The shadows in the mirror started to move closer to their reflected selves, and as they did, the team could feel a cold, clammy touch on their shoulders and necks, even though nothing was visible. Riley let out a yelp as something unseen brushed against his arm, and he fired his weapon blindly into the darkness. The muzzle flash illuminated the room for a brief second, revealing twisted, grotesque faces inches from their own, before everything plunged back into darkness. A deep, guttural growl reverberated through the room, shaking the very floor beneath them. "We have to get out of here," Sophia screamed, her voice barely rising above the cacophony of growls and whispers. Davis grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the door. But the door, which had slammed shut with such finality earlier, now creaked open slowly, as if inviting them to leave, or leading them into another trap. The team didn't have a choice. They bolted for the door, bursting into the hallway, but the darkness seemed to follow them, clinging to them like a living thing. The hallway was even more oppressive than before, the walls seeming to close in on them as they ran. The shadows twisted and shifted, shapes flickering just at the edge of their vision. Sophia stopped suddenly, her breath catching in her throat. She saw someone, standing at the end of the hallway. A little girl, dressed in an old-fashioned white dress, her hair hanging in matted clumps around her face. Her eyes were black voids, and as she opened her mouth, an ear-piercing scream erupted, reverberating through the hallway, making the very walls shake. The lights flickered, and when they stabilized, the girl was gone. But the scream continued, echoing around them, disorienting them, making it impossible to tell where the sound was coming from. "Go, go, go," Davis shouted, pulling them toward a stairwell. But as they reached it, the ground beneath them started to tremble violently. A crack appeared in the floor, widening quickly, and from the darkness below, the red glow of malevolent eyes stared up at them. The mansion wasn't just haunted, It was alive, and it was hungry. The stairwell seemed to spiral endlessly downward into the bowels of the mansion, the darkness growing thicker with each step. Their flashlights barely illuminated the steps in front of them, and the walls seemed to close in, suffocating them with an unseen force. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and rotting flesh, and the low, guttural growls from below made their blood run cold. Davis led the way, his heart pounding in his chest. The screams from above still echoed faintly in their ears, mixing with the whispers that surrounded them. He could feel the malevolent presence growing stronger as they descended, as if the mansion itself was pulling them deeper into its core, where the darkness was most potent. Suddenly, the stairwell opened into a vast, cavernous chamber. The walls were lined with crumbling stone, slick with moisture, and the floor was covered in a thick black sludge that squelched under their boots. The air was heavy with the stench of death, and the red glow from before seemed to emanate from the very walls, casting an eerie light over the room. At the center of the chamber was a large, circular pit, its depths obscured by darkness. Faint, agonized moans echoed up from the pit, mixing with the whispers that had followed them from above. The sound was a chorus of torment, a symphony of the damned. What is this place?" Riley whispered, his voice shaking as he stared at the pit. "It's a gateway," Sophia said, her voice trembling. "A gateway to something evil." The air grew colder, and the moans from the pit grew louder, more desperate. Shadows began to flicker at the edge of their vision, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The very ground beneath them vibrated, as if something massive and powerful was stirring beneath the surface. Suddenly, a massive, clawed hand burst from the pit, slamming into the ground with a force that shook the entire chamber. The team stumbled backward, their flashlights flickering as the shadows closed in around them. The hand was followed by another, and then a massive, twisted figure began to pull itself out of the pit, its body covered in slick black scales that glistened in the red light. The creature's eyes glowed with a deep, malevolent fire, and its mouth opened in a wide, fanged grin that dripped with thick black ichor. It let out a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the chamber, shaking the walls and sending a wave of fear through the team. "We need to get out of here now," Davis shouted, his voice barely audible over the creature's growls. The team bolted for the nearest exit, but the shadows seemed to close in around them, twisting and writhing like living things. The creature let out a deafening roar, and the ground beneath them cracked and splintered, as if the very foundation of the mansion was tearing itself apart. Sophia screamed as a shadowy tendril wrapped around her leg, pulling her back toward the pit. Davis and Riley grabbed her arms, pulling with all their strength, but the tendril was strong, impossibly strong. Sophia's screams echoed through the chamber as she was dragged closer to the edge. "Help me, please," she cried, her voice desperate. But before they could act, the ground beneath them gave way, and they were plunged into the darkness below, their screams joining the chorus of the damned. The darkness swallowed them whole. As they fell, the walls of the pit seemed to stretch endlessly, the air growing colder and thicker with each passing second. The fall was not just physical. It felt like they were descending into a different reality, a place where the laws of nature didn't apply. The screams of the damned echoed around them, growing louder and more distorted, twisting into something otherworldly. Sophia hit the ground first, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She gasped for breath, the air thick and cloying, tasting of iron and decay. The others landed soon after, groaning in pain as they struggled to their feet. The ground beneath them was soft and uneven, like they were standing on a thick layer of decomposing bodies. "Is everyone okay?" Davis's voice was hoarse, strained with fear and exhaustion. "Barely," Riley grunted, clutching his side where he had landed awkwardly. "What the hell is this place?" Sophia shined her flashlight around, the beam weak and flickering. The pit was deeper than they had imagined, the walls slick with a dark, viscous substance that oozed down in rivulets. The floor was a mass of writhing, shadowy tendrils that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, shifting and moving underfoot. "It's like we're inside something," Sophia whispered, horror creeping into her voice. The realization hit them all at once. They were not just in the mansion anymore. They had been dragged into its heart, a place that was not of this world. The mansion wasn't just haunted, it was a living entity, a creature of darkness and malevolence that had ensnared them in its trap. The shadows on the walls began to move, coalescing into twisted, grotesque shapes that slithered and crawled toward them. Davis raised his gun, firing into the darkness, but the bullets did nothing. The shadows seemed to absorb the impact, growing larger and more solid with each shot. "We have to find a way out of here," Davis shouted, backing up toward the center of the pit. But as he turned, he saw the twisted figure from before, towering over them, its eyes burning with hatred. The creature lunged forward, its massive hands swiping at them with blinding speed. Sophia and Riley barely managed to dodge, but Davis was not as lucky. The hand caught him across the chest, sending him flying into the wall with a sickening crunch. "Davis!" Sophia screamed, rushing to his side. Blood poured from his wounds, pooling on the ground beneath him. His eyes were wide with shock, his breathing shallow and ragged. Get out of here," he wheezed, his voice barely audible. "It's too late for me." But before she could respond, the shadows closed in around them, the tendrils wrapping around Davis's body and dragging him into the darkness. His screams echoed through the pit, mixing with the other tormented souls as he disappeared from sight. Sophia and Riley backed away, their hearts pounding with terror. The creature's laughter echoed through the chamber, a deep, guttural sound that shook them to their core. They were trapped, alone in the belly of the beast, with no hope of escape. The darkness pressed in on them, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the very walls were speaking to them. The pit was alive, a twisted, malevolent force that fed on their fear, driving them to the brink of madness. And as the shadows closed in, they realized that there was no escape. The mansion had them, and it would never let them go. The darkness was suffocating. Sophia and Riley stumbled through the pitch-black tunnels, their flashlights barely cutting through the thick, oppressive air. The walls were alive with movement, shifting and pulsating as if they were inside a living organism. The whispers were everywhere now, growing louder, overlapping each other in a cacophony of voices that threatened to drive them mad. "What the hell is this place?" Riley gasped, his voice trembling with fear. He could feel the presence of the creature behind them, stalking them through the twisting passages, but every turn seemed to lead them deeper into the labyrinth. Sophia didn't answer. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of the nightmare they had been dragged into. The walls, the shadows, the whispers. It all felt like a dream, but the pain and the fear were all too real. She could feel her sanity slipping, fraying at the edges as the darkness closed in around them. They turned a corner and suddenly found themselves in a large, open chamber. The walls were covered in what looked like flesh, pulsating with a sickly, pale light. The room was filled with faces, hundreds of them, twisted and contorted in agony, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They were embedded in the walls, their mouths open in silent screams, their skin stretched taut over the stone. "Oh, God!" Riley whispered, backing away from the horrific sight. The faces seemed to watch them, their empty eyes following their every move. Sophia approached one of the faces, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a woman, her face frozen in a mask of terror, her eyes wide and unseeing. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and touched the face. The skin was cold and clammy, like touching a corpse. As soon as she made contact, the woman's eyes snapped open, locking onto Sophia's. "Sophia!" The voice was a rasp, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a chill down her spine. "Help me, please." Sophia stumbled back, her heart racing. The face in the wall began to writhe and twist, as if trying to break free from its prison. The other faces joined in, their silent screams growing louder, filling the chamber with a deafening chorus of agony. Riley grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the wall. "We have to get out of here," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the screams. But as they turned to leave, the faces began to stretch and contort, their mouths opening wider and wider, until they were nothing more than gaping holes of darkness. The walls began to close in, the faces reaching out with twisted, clawed hands, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The floor beneath them started to crack and split, and from the fissures, thick black tendrils emerged, wrapping around their legs and pulling them down. Sophia and Riley fought desperately, but the tendrils were too strong, dragging them closer to the walls. The faces began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the chamber, growing louder and more distorted until it was a roar of pure madness. Sophia's mind was breaking, the laughter filling her head, drowning out all reason. The walls closed in, and the darkness swallowed them whole. The last thing she saw before the shadows claimed her was the face of Davis, twisted and contorted in agony, his eyes hollow and lifeless, just like the others. Sophia awoke with a start, her heart pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness was absolute, but she could feel something, someone, watching her. Panic surged through her veins as she fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The light flickered on, revealing a small, cold room with stone walls and a low ceiling. The walls were damp, and the air was thick with the stench of rot. She was alone, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. It was as if the very darkness around her was alive, sentient, and hungry. "Riley?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the echo of her voice in the oppressive silence. Suddenly, a sound, like the scraping of claws on stone, echoed from the shadows. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. She swung the flashlight toward the noise, but the beam only illuminated more of the cold, empty room. The sound came again, closer this time, and then she saw it, a figure lurking just out of the light's reach, its form barely discernible in the gloom. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its skin was a sickly gray, stretched tight over its skeletal frame. Its eyes were hollow pits of darkness, and its mouth was a gaping maw, filled with jagged, broken teeth. The creature's long, bony fingers scratched at the stone walls as it moved closer, its head twitching unnaturally from side to side. Sophia backed away, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs refused to move. The creature stepped into the light, and she saw it clearly for the first time. Its face was a grotesque mockery of human features, twisted into a permanent snarl. It was no longer just a shadow or a figment of her imagination. It was real, and it was right in front of her. She turned to flee, but the door she hadn't noticed before was now sealed, the stones seamlessly blending into the wall. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, its breath hot and rancid against her face. It was toying with her, savoring her fear. Sophia's mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. She noticed a small, narrow passageway at the far end of the room, barely big enough for her to squeeze through. Without thinking, she bolted for it, her flashlight swinging wildly as she ran. The creature let out a shriek of rage and lunged after her, its claws scraping the stone floor. Sophia dove into the passage, the walls scraping against her as she forced herself through the tight space. The creature was right behind her, its snarls echoing in the confined space, growing louder and more frantic as it closed in. Sophia's lungs burned, her vision blurred, but she kept pushing forward, driven by sheer terror. She could feel the creature's breath on the back of her neck, its claws raking her back as it reached for her. Suddenly, the passage widened, and she tumbled out into a large, open chamber. The creature's shrieks filled the air as it was forced to stop, unable to fit through the narrow passage. For a moment, she was safe, but as she looked around the chamber, she realized her nightmare was far from over. The chamber was filled with rows of stone coffins, each one sealed with a heavy lid. The walls were adorned with faded, ancient symbols, and in the center of the room stood a massive, blood-stained altar. The air was thick with the stench of death, and a cold, malevolent presence lingered in the shadows. Sophia knew she had only bought herself a little time. Whatever horror awaited her in this chamber was far worse than the creature she had just escaped. She could feel it, something ancient, something evil, waiting for her, lurking in the darkness, ready to claim her soul. Sophia stood frozen in the center of the chamber, her eyes darting around the room. The sense of foreboding was overwhelming, pressing down on her chest like a weight. The coffins lining the walls seemed to pulsate with an eerie energy, and the symbols etched into the stone glowed faintly, as if imbued with a life of their own. She felt a chill run down her spine as she approached the altar, her flashlight flickering as if struggling against the oppressive darkness. The altar was old, ancient even, and covered in dark, dried blood. Her hand trembled as she reached out to touch it, drawn by a force she couldn't explain. As her fingers brushed the cold stone, a sudden violent shudder ran through the chamber. The floor trembled, and the lids of the coffins began to creak open, one by one. Sophia stumbled back in horror as the smell of decay filled the air, a stench so foul it made her gag. The coffins opened slowly, revealing their grisly contents. Decayed, skeletal remains lay within, their hollow eye sockets staring out into the darkness. But these were no ordinary corpses. As the lids fully opened, the skeletons began to move, their bones creaking and cracking as they came to life. Sophia's heart raced as the skeletal figures began to rise, their movements slow and deliberate. They turned their empty eyes toward her, their jaws opening in silent screams. There was no flesh left on them, only brittle bones held together by some dark, unholy magic. The symbols on the walls flared to life, casting an eerie red glow over the chamber. The skeletons moved toward her, their bony hands reaching out, eager to claim her as one of their own. Sophia backed away, her mind reeling with terror. This was no ordinary haunting. This was a ritual, a dark and ancient rite to awaken the dead. Desperation surged through her. She had to escape, but the only exit was back through the narrow passage, where the creature still waited. The skeletons closed in, their hollow eyes burning with a malevolent fire. Sophia could feel their cold, deathly presence as they encircled her, trapping her against the altar. Suddenly, the chamber was filled with a low, guttural chanting, the words unintelligible but heavy with dark power. The skeletons stopped, turning their heads toward the altar as the chanting grew louder, more insistent. The altar itself began to pulse with a dark energy, the bloodstains glowing as if freshly spilled. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as she realized what was happening. The altar wasn't just a relic, it was a conduit, a portal to another realm. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and the air around the altar shimmered with a dark, unnatural light. She could feel the presence of something vast and evil pushing through, straining to enter this world. The skeletons suddenly dropped to their knees, their heads bowed in reverence as the light around the altar grew brighter. Sophia's mind screamed at her to run, but her body was frozen in place, held captive by the sheer terror of what was about to emerge. With a final, earth-shaking roar, the light flared blindingly bright, and a figure began to materialize on the altar. A figure of pure darkness, its form shifting and writhing as it forced its way into the chamber. The air grew thick with the stench of sulfur, and the temperature plummeted, frost forming on the walls. Sophia knew she was staring into the face of pure evil. This was no ordinary spirit, no vengeful ghost. This was a demon, an ancient and powerful entity that had been summoned by the dark rites performed in this unholy place. It had been waiting dormant for centuries, and now it was awake, hungry for souls. The demon's eyes locked onto Sophia's, and she felt her sanity begin to unravel. The shadows around her seemed to close in, and the last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the demon's twisted, malevolent grin, promising her an eternity of torment. Sophia awoke to a suffocating darkness. Her body felt heavy, as if the weight of the entire chamber was pressing down on her. She tried to move, but something held her in place, cold, hard restraints digging into her wrists and ankles. Panic flared as she realized she was strapped to the blood-stained altar. The air was thick with the stench of decay and sulfur, a foul mix that made her gag. A low, sinister whispering filled the chamber, a cacophony of voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. The chanting had stopped, but the energy in the room was more oppressive than ever, as if the very walls were closing in on her. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, leaving a silence so profound it roared in her ears. Then, out of the shadows, the demon stepped forward, its form barely human, shrouded in darkness that seemed to swallow the dim light. Its eyes, burning red coals, locked onto her with a hunger that sent ice through her veins. "Let me go." Sophia's voice was barely more than a whimper, the words trembling on her lips. But the demon only smiled, a grotesque, twisted grin that revealed rows of jagged teeth. It leaned in closer, its breath hot and rancid against her skin. "You are the key," it hissed, its voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the very air. "The blood that binds you will open the gate." Sophia's heart pounded in her chest, and she struggled against the restraints, but they held firm. The demon raised one long, clawed finger, tracing a line down her arm. Pain shot through her as its claw dug into her flesh, drawing blood that flowed in a dark, steady stream onto the altar. The moment her blood touched the stone, the chamber trembled violently. The symbols on the walls flared to life again, burning with an intense, fiery glow. The skeletons, still kneeling in reverence, began to chant once more, their voices rising in unison with the demons. Sophia's vision blurred as the pain intensified, her blood pouring out faster now, seeping into the cracks of the altar. The light around her grew blindingly bright, and the air hummed with a dark, malevolent energy. The demon's grin widened, its eyes glowing with triumph as the ritual neared completion. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, the chamber was rocked by a deafening explosion. The walls cracked, and chunks of stone rained down from the ceiling. The light flickered and dimmed as the ground beneath the altar split open, revealing a swirling vortex of darkness. Out of the chaos, a figure emerged, a man dressed in tactical gear, his face obscured by a mask. Without hesitation, he lunged at the demon, a glowing blade in his hand. The demon shrieked in rage as the blade struck true, cutting through its shadowy form with a flash of light. Sophia's restraints snapped as the altar crumbled, and she fell to the floor, gasping for breath. The vortex widened, pulling the demon down into its depths, its screams echoing through the chamber. The skeletons collapsed into piles of bones, their dark magic severed. The man turned to her, his eyes softening as he knelt by her side. "You're safe now," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. But before she could respond, the floor gave way beneath them, and they were swallowed by the darkness, plummeting into the unknown. Sophia felt herself falling through endless darkness, her body weightless, her mind spinning. The air rushed past her, cold and biting, as if she was being pulled deeper into an abyss with no end. She reached out, grasping at the void, but there was nothing to hold on to, nothing but the overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly, her descent slowed, and she landed hard on a cold, damp surface. The impact knocked the breath out of her, and for a moment, she lay there, dazed and disoriented. The darkness was absolute, impenetrable, but the ground beneath her felt rough, uneven, like ancient stone. A faint, flickering light appeared in the distance, growing brighter as it approached. Sophia forced herself to stand, her legs shaking beneath her. The light revealed a narrow corridor, the walls lined with jagged rocks and tangled roots. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sharp. The light moved closer, revealing the man who had saved her, his mask still in place, but his eyes, pale and intense, shone with an eerie glow. He didn't speak, only gestured for her to follow. With no other option, Sophia complied, her heart pounding in her chest as they ventured deeper into the corridor. The further they went, the narrower the passage became, until they had to squeeze through, the rough stones scraping against their skin. The light flickered and dimmed, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. Sophia's breathing grew labored, the air thick with a suffocating pressure. Just as the corridor seemed to close in entirely, it opened up into a vast cavern. The walls were lined with rows of ancient, decaying bookshelves, their contents spilling out in heaps of moldering paper. In the center of the cavern stood a massive black stone obelisk, its surface covered in pulsating red symbols that seemed to shift and writhe like living things. The man stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the obelisk. Sophia felt a wave of nausea as she looked at it, a sense of wrongness that made her want to turn and run. But something held her in place, something more than fear, curiosity, or perhaps the realization that this was the end, the heart of the darkness that had consumed her. The man approached the obelisk, placing his hand on its surface. The symbols flared brightly, and the cavern shook with a deep, resonant hum. The air around them grew colder, the shadows deeper, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Sophia backed away, her instincts screaming at her to flee, but the exit had vanished, swallowed by the darkness. The man turned to her, his eyes glowing brighter now, almost blinding in their intensity. "This is where it ends," he said, his voice echoing with an otherworldly power. "This is where it begins." The obelisk cracked, a thin line of light seeping through the stone. The hum grew louder, a deafening roar that reverberated through the cavern. Sophia felt the ground shift beneath her, the very air vibrating with a force that threatened to tear her apart. With a final, earth-shattering explosion, the obelisk shattered, releasing a blinding torrent of light. Sophia screamed as the light enveloped her, burning her skin, her eyes, her very soul. The man was consumed by the light, his form dissolving into nothingness. And then there was silence. The light faded, the cavern crumbled, and Sophia was left alone in the darkness, the echoes of the ritual still ringing in her ears. The world around her dissolved into shadow, and she fell once more into the endless void. In the darkness, a single thought remained, a whisper, faint but insistent. "It's not over.